The first sign of trouble came when Nolan took a bite. The dining hall aboard the Xilvani diplomatic vessel had been quiet, the kind of quiet that suggested either deep concentration or barely concealed tension. In this case, it was both. The Xilvani delegation sat across the table from the human envoy, their iridescent blue skin shimmering under the artificial lighting. Their leader, Ambassador Julek, had spoken at length about interspecies cooperation, trade agreements, and cultural exchange. It had all been going well until Nolan picked up a slice of raw fish with his chopsticks and placed it in his mouth. A sharp, chittering gasp echoed through the room. The Xilvani aides recoiled, their elongated fingers curling inward. One of them, a junior diplomat named Vesh, nearly knocked over a goblet of some amber-colored liquid. Julek's wide, black eyes fixed on Nolan with undisguised horror. "You just consumed uncooked flesh." Nolan chewed, swallowed, and blinked in confusion. Yeah, it's sushi." The silence that followed was so absolute that Nolan could hear the hum of the ship's environmental systems. He glanced at his fellow human delegate, a linguist named Mara, who looked equally confused but also slightly amused. Julek's voice took on a hushed, urgent tone. "Are you unwell?" "I feel fine," Nolan said, unsure why half the room looked ready to call for medical assistance. Vesh, still gripping the edge of the table, whispered something in Xilvani to another aide. The aide bolted from the room. Mara cleared her throat. "Ambassador, I think there's a misunderstanding here." Julek leaned forward, his long fingers splayed against the table. "You have ingested raw, uncooked biological material. Humans are not immune to microbial threats. The contamination could be fatal." "Oh," Nolan said, realization dawning. No, this is prepared food. It's safe." Julek didn't look convinced. "That cannot be. Uncooked tissue carries disease. You should be quarantined immediately." "This is a normal human dish," Mara added. "It's called sushi. The fish is specifically chosen for safe consumption. It's not dangerous." Julek's gaze flicked between the two of them. "You mean to say, your species deliberately eats uncooked animal flesh?" Nolan nodded slowly. "Yeah." Vesh, who had only just begun to recover, made a small choking sound. "This is a common practice." "Oh yeah," Nolan said. "People love sushi. It's delicious." Julek whispered something to himself, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to one of his aides. "Summon a medical team. The human may require immediate treatment." Nolan put his hands up. "I don't need treatment." Julek's expression remained grave. "You may not feel it yet, but the effects could be delayed." Mara sighed. "I promise you, he's fine. This is normal for us." Julek did not look reassured. "We must test for pathogens." Before Nolan could protest, the doors slid open, and a pair of Xilvani medics rushed in carrying scanning devices. One of them immediately began running a handheld scanner over Nolan's body, while the other set up a diagnostic terminal. "This is unnecessary," Nolan muttered as he sat still to avoid any sudden movements that might make things worse. The medic glanced at Julek. "No immediate signs of contamination, but we should monitor closely for the next few hours." Julek exhaled, his posture still tense. "We cannot allow diplomatic relations to begin with the death of a human envoy due to food poisoning." Mara pinched the bridge of her nose. "He's not dying." Julek's fingers twitched. "We must confirm that." Nolan sighed. "Look, if it makes you feel better, I'll let your medical team do their tests. But I promise you, this is just food." Julek leaned back slightly, though his tension did not ease. "Our species has spent millennia refining food safety. The idea that another species would willingly consume raw animal flesh is deeply unsettling." "It's not like we eat just anything raw," Nolan said. "Sushi is carefully prepared." "We would like to see this preparation," Julek said suddenly. Mara and Nolan exchanged looks. "You want us to make sushi?" Mara asked. Julek nodded. "If you claim this is safe, we must see the process ourselves. If it is truly prepared in a way that eliminates contamination, we will reconsider our concerns." Nolan hesitated. I didn't bring a sushi chef with me. Julek tilted his head. Your species has specialists for this. Yeah, Nolan said. Making good sushi takes skill. Julek considered this. Then we will arrange for one to be brought here. Julek turned to Vesh. Contact the nearest human outpost. Request a specialist in this sushi process. Vesh nodded, though he still looked disturbed. Nolan gave Mara a helpless look. This is going to be a whole thing, isn't it? It's already a whole thing, Mara muttered. Julek stood. Until we have proof, we will monitor your health closely. If you show any signs of distress, you must report it immediately. I'll let you know if I feel even slightly off, Nolan promised. Julek nodded, though the tension in his posture remained. We will reconvene once we have secured a proper demonstration. As the Xilvani filed out of the room, the two humans sat in silence for a long moment. Mara finally exhaled. You freaked them out so badly they're calling in a sushi chef from deep space. Nolan leaned back in his chair. I really didn't see this coming. Mara shook her head. You've been on a first contact mission for 3 weeks. How have you not learned that everything about humans is weird to aliens? Nolan rubbed his face. I just wanted lunch. Mara patted his shoulder. Well, congratulations. You've started an intergalactic culinary incident. Nolan groaned. It's going to be a long few days, isn't it? Mara stood. Oh, absolutely. The request for a sushi chef had been sent, and the waiting began. Nolan had hoped the matter would resolve itself quickly, but the Xelvani were not a species that let concerns lie unattended. Within an hour, a medical team had stationed themselves outside his quarters, monitoring his condition as though he might suddenly collapse from his meal. Mara, sitting across from him in the small lounge area, kept glancing at the door where one of the medics periodically peeked in. They're really committed to this, she said. Nolan rubbed his temples. I get the feeling they don't do casual when it comes to health risks. Before Mara could respond, the door slid open, and Ambassador Julek stepped inside, his expression unreadable. A human culinary specialist has been located, he announced. They will arrive on board within the next cycle. Nolan nodded. That's great. Maybe once they see the process, they'll relax. Julek remained standing, his fingers interlaced. In the meantime, we wish to understand more. Your species must have developed resistance to foodborne contaminants. How did this come to be? Mara leaned forward. We have food safety regulations, refrigeration, proper handling techniques. Our digestive systems can handle a lot, but it's not like we can eat anything and survive. We just have methods to reduce risk. Julek's head tilted slightly, yet your body still contained microbial life. Yeah, Nolan said. We have a microbiome bacteria that live inside us that actually help us function. Julek's posture stiffened. You coexist with internal microorganisms. Mara nodded. We wouldn't survive without them. A quiet exchange in Xilvani followed, the aides murmuring amongst themselves. Julek's expression was difficult to read, but his next words carried a note of incredulity. And this is considered beneficial. It's necessary, Mara clarified. Our bodies evolved with them. Julek exhaled slowly. Your species is remarkably unconventional. Nolan gave a small shrug. We adapt. Julek regarded them both for a moment before speaking again. We will observe your specialists closely. If we are to trust this practice, we must see every step. Mara nodded. That's fair. Julek turned to leave but paused at the doorway. And if this demonstration fails to convince us? Nolan hesitated. Then we'll have to figure out another way to bridge this gap. Julek gave a slow nod before exiting. The door closed behind him, leaving the two humans in thoughtful silence. Mara tapped her fingers against the table. They really don't take any biological risks, do they? Not even a little, Nolan muttered. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This might be the slowest diplomatic crisis ever. Mara chuckled. At least it's a unique one. They both fell quiet, waiting for the arrival of the one person who could hopefully smooth this over a sushi chef who had no idea they were about to become a cultural envoy. The Xilvani Culinary Observation Chamber was a gleaming, sterile space designed for controlled food preparation. Every surface was made of smooth, reflective material, and the air carried a faint antiseptic scent. A dozen Xilvani stood at the edges of the room, their posture tense as they watched the human chef unpack their supplies. Rei Tanaka had been rushed in from a nearby human outpost, still looking mildly disoriented from the abrupt summons. A compact woman with sharp eyes and a quiet efficiency, she laid out her ingredients with practiced ease. The Xilvani observers stiffened as she placed raw fish onto the counter. Ambassador Julek stood closest, arms folded. He had not spoken since the demonstration began, but his gaze was locked onto the chef's every movement. Raya adjusted her knife, glancing at Nolan and Mara. "I assume you need me to prove this isn't some reckless death wish." Mara gave a tired nod. "That about sums it up." Raya exhaled through her nose. "All right," she turned to the Xilvani. "I will explain as I work." Julek gave a small nod, though his expression remained guarded. Raya began slicing. The fish used in sushi isn't just any raw meat. It's selected carefully, handled properly, and stored at precise temperatures to eliminate harmful organisms. This ensures it's safe for consumption. Julek's gaze flicked between the knife and the fillet. "You claim your species has mastered the elimination of microbial threats without application of heat." Raya gave a measured nod. "Not complete elimination, but control. Freezing at extremely low temperatures kills most parasites. Handling with sterilized tools prevents contamination. The risk is minimal when done correctly." Vesh, standing slightly behind Julek, murmured something in hushed Xilvani. Julek gave a slow blink before focusing on Raya again. "And this knowledge is widely accepted among your kind." Raya's knife glided smoothly as she continued her work. "Very. Sushi has been eaten for centuries." A ripple of unease passed through the Xilvani. One of the aides clasped their hands together tightly. Raya said nothing, letting the silence settle as she shaped the rice. The contrast between her precise, fluid motions and the Xilvani's barely concealed apprehension was stark. Julek finally spoke again. "You have explained the safety. Now what is the purpose?" Raya's hands didn't pause. "Purpose." Julek's jaw tightened slightly. "Why would your species choose this method of consumption when alternatives exist?" Nolan spoke before Raya could. "Because it tastes good." Julek's gaze snapped to him. "You mean to say, this is not a necessity, but preference?" Mara crossed her arms. "Food isn't just about survival for us. It's cultural. It's an experience." Julek's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers curled slightly. "You take risks for the sake of sensory enjoyment." Raya placed a finished sushi roll onto a tray. "It's not a risk if it's done right. It's craft." The Xilvani exchanged glances. Vesh's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Raya gestured to the tray. "This is ready." Julek stared at the neatly arranged pieces. The room remained still. No one moved. Nolan leaned slightly toward Mara. "I don't think they're going to volunteer." Mara sighed. "You're probably right." Julek finally spoke, voice measured. "If we are to understand, we must experience." A murmur rippled through the Xilvani. Vesh looked particularly alarmed. Julek ignored it and reached for a piece. His fingers hesitated just above the surface before he picked it up. The room held its breath as he raised it to his mouth and took a small bite. The silence stretched unbearably long. Then Julek blinked. Slowly he chewed. His expression remained unreadable, but he did not recoil. He swallowed, exhaling softly. The tension in the room did not dissipate, but curiosity flickered in Julek's gaze. He studied the remaining sushi on the tray before speaking, his voice quieter than before. "This is unexpected." Vesh still looked as though he wanted to intervene, but when Julek did not immediately collapse, his posture loosened marginally. Julek turned to Rai. I wish to observe the process again. Rai nodded, already preparing another roll. The Xilvani had not fully accepted this, but the fear had begun to shift into something else: fascination. Julek remained by the preparation station, observing Rai's technique with a focus that bordered on reverence. The other Xilvani, though still tense, had drawn slightly closer, their apprehension tempered by curiosity. No one else had dared to try the sushi, but the fact that Julek had eaten it and remained unharmed had shifted the atmosphere. Raya worked with quiet efficiency, slicing fresh pieces of fish with careful precision. Julek's eyes tracked each movement, taking in the balance of blade angles, the delicate way the rice was shaped, and the controlled assembly of the rolls. He did not interrupt, but his posture suggested deep contemplation. Nolan leaned slightly toward Mara, keeping his voice low. I think we just turned sushi into a scientific marvel. Mara, arms crossed, exhaled through her nose. I'd say cultural phenomenon. Julek finally spoke without breaking his gaze from Rai's hands. Your species places great emphasis on the artistry of food preparation. Rai nodded without pausing. Presentation is part of the experience. The balance of texture, taste, and visual appeal matters. Julek considered this. It is not merely consumption, but a crafted experience. Rai's lips pressed together briefly before she responded. That's a good way to put it. One of the Xilvani aides, who had remained at the farthest edge of the chamber, took a hesitant step forward. They did not speak, but their gaze lingered on the tray where Julek's uneaten sushi remained. The tension in their body betrayed their internal debate. Julek noticed. He turned toward them, his voice calm. You are not required to partake, but understanding requires participation. The aide hesitated before taking another step. Their fingers twitched slightly as they reached for a piece, lifting it with careful deliberation. The rest of the Xilvani delegation remained silent, their attention now entirely focused on this single act. The aide brought the sushi to their mouth and took a measured bite. Their posture stiffened as they chewed, and for a moment it seemed as though they were bracing for some delayed catastrophe. Nothing happened. A slow breath escaped them as they swallowed. Their expression remained neutral, but there was no immediate protest. They glanced at Julek, then at the remaining pieces. Julek's gaze was steady. Your assessment. The aide took a moment before responding. It is different. The layering of flavors is unexpected. Julek turned back to Rai. Your species has developed a practice that merges sustenance with sensory refinement. Rai wiped her blade clean, nodding. Food tells a story. Julek exhaled slowly, processing this. The other Xilvani murmured among themselves, the rigid fear that had gripped them earlier beginning to dissolve. Nolan, watching the shift unfold, let out a quiet breath. I think we just made progress. Mara gave a small nod. They're still hesitant, but they're engaging. That's the first step. Another Xilvani moved forward, this one visibly younger, their curiosity outweighing their apprehension. They selected a piece and studied it before taking a bite. Julek observed them closely, then turned back to Nolan and Mara. This will require further discussion. But I admit my perspective has shifted. Rai set down her knife, looking at Julek. That's all we ask. Julek inclined his head slightly. You have given us much to consider. The room was no longer heavy with tension. Instead, the air carried something else: cautious intrigue, the first steps of understanding. The Xilvani had not fully accepted the practice, but they were no longer rejecting it outright. And for now, that was enough. The Xilvani delegation did not immediately embrace sushi, but they no longer regarded it as a reckless act of self-destruction. That, in itself, was progress. Julek had sampled it without incident, and 2 others had followed his lead. The rest remained wary, but their fear had shifted into something more analytical, a need to understand rather than outright reject. Rai continued preparing additional rolls, each movement precise and deliberate. The Xilvani watched closely, occasionally exchanging quiet words among themselves. Though they had not fully accepted the practice, Their engagement suggested they were beginning to recognize its significance. Julek observed Rei's hands as she adjusted the rice. This process requires discipline. It is not simply a matter of ingestion. Rei nodded, adjusting the angle of her knife. There's a reason sushi chefs train for years. Mastery takes time. One of the younger Xilvani, who had been silent until now, spoke hesitantly. Among our own, food is strictly for sustenance. The idea of dedicating oneself to its preparation in such a way is unfamiliar. Nolan leaned forward slightly. So you don't have culinary arts at all? The young Xilvani glanced at Julek before replying. Our food production is standardized, ensuring optimal nutrition and safety. There is no variation, no individual preparation. Mara's brow furrowed. So everything tastes the same. Julek inclined his head. It is consistent. Rei placed another completed roll onto the tray. Consistency has its benefits, but variety allows for exploration. Each ingredient, each technique, it all contributes to the experience. Julek considered this, his fingers tapping lightly against the table's surface. Your species assigns meaning to the act of eating beyond survival. Nolan nodded. Food connects people. It carries history, tradition, identity. The Xilvani delegation exchanged glances. Some expressions remained skeptical, but others held traces of curiosity. Mesh, who had been among the most visibly disturbed earlier, took a hesitant step forward. If food can hold meaning, then would this sushi be considered significant among your people? Mara glanced at Rei, who spoke without looking up. Sushi has deep roots in our history. It evolved over centuries, influenced by culture, geography, and trade. For many, it represents craftsmanship and tradition. Julek's gaze lingered on the tray. Then it is more than nourishment. It is an extension of your identity. Rei set down her knife. Exactly. Silence settled over the room. The Xilvani were not yet fully convinced, but something had shifted. They were no longer just watching, they were thinking, processing. Finally, Julek exhaled. This will require further study, but I believe we have taken a step toward understanding. Nolan exchanged a look with Mara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had not expected sushi to become the focal point of diplomatic exchange, but here they were. Rei wiped down her station and looked at Julek. Would you like me to continue? Julek hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Yes, we must learn more. And with that, the demonstration continued, not as a mere explanation, but as the beginning of something deeper, a genuine exchange of perspective. Julek studied the latest roll on the tray, his expression calm but intent. Across the room, the other Xilvani maintained their cautious distance, though a few had edged closer, their earlier unease giving way to quiet speculation. The only sound was the faint scrape of Rei's knife against the cutting board as she prepared another set of pieces. After a moment, Julek gestured toward Nolan. Your species values this dish not simply for sustenance, but for its refinement. Yet I assume not all human food follows such strict preparation. Mara nodded. Not everything is as intricate as sushi. Some meals are quick, others are elaborate. It depends on the culture, the occasion. Julek glanced between them. Then meals are categorized beyond mere nutritional necessity. Rei set down her knife with a practiced motion. Food can be ceremonial, celebratory, comforting. It can be personal or communal. Vesh folded his arms, his posture less rigid than before. And this is universal among your people. Nolan shrugged. Cultures vary, but the idea of food being more than just fuel is pretty common. Julek considered this, his fingers brushing over the tabletop. You have demonstrated the preparation and explained its significance. But there is still one matter that remains unclear. Mara raised an eyebrow. Which is? Julek met her gaze. Why take the risk at all? Rei wiped her blade clean before responding. Because without risk, there's no discovery. Julek's head tilted slightly. Rei gestured toward the tray. Everything we do, cooking, exploring, creating, it all involves some level of uncertainty. If we avoided anything with the slightest potential for harm, we'd never grow, never innovate. Vesh exhaled, his expression thoughtful. So your species embraces calculated uncertainty. Nolan nodded. We prepare, we adapt, we refine. That's how we make things work. Julek regarded them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached for another piece of sushi. The rest of the Xilvani delegation stiffened, but no one spoke. He took a bite. The silence stretched as he chewed, his expression unreadable. When he finally swallowed, he exhaled steadily. It is unlike anything we have known. Vesh hesitated before speaking. And yet, you do not reject it. Julek placed the remaining sushi back onto the tray. No, I do not. A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the Xilvani, though none carried the same apprehension as before. The shift had happened not as a grand revelation, but as a gradual loosening of rigid preconceptions. Julek turned to Rai. You have given us much to consider. Rai inclined her head. That's all I came here to do? Julek's gaze swept over the room before settling on Nolan and Mara. This encounter has altered our understanding in ways we did not anticipate. Nolan exhaled. It's been an experience, that's for sure. Julek's posture relaxed slightly. Indeed. The tension that had once filled the room had settled into something else, not quite comfort, but a mutual recognition of perspectives. The Xilvani had not fully embraced human culinary traditions, but they had taken the first step beyond rigid caution. Julek met Rai's gaze once more. We will need time to process this, but I believe it is a worthwhile endeavor. Rai wiped down her station. Take all the time you need. Julek glanced at the remaining sushi on the tray before stepping back. This has been an enlightening exchange. Nolan gave a small nod. For all of us. Julek turned toward the other Xilvani. We will discuss this further among ourselves. For now, we conclude this session. With that, the delegation began to file out, their movements no longer carrying the same rigid unease. A few glanced back at the tray, their expressions thoughtful. Mara stretched her arms. Well, that was probably the most intense meal demonstration in diplomatic history. Rai packed up her tools. Glad I could help. Nolan exhaled, leaning against the counter. Think they'll ever get used to it. Mara smirked. Give it a few decades. Rai glanced at the emptying room. They don't have to love it. They just have to understand it. Nolan nodded. And I think we got them there. The Xilvani had come in fearing contamination, disruption, uncertainty. They left with something else perspective. And for now, that was enough.